everyone. My name is Evie Lupine. Welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all. If you have been watching my content for a while, you know that one of my favorite things is to talk about the scientific truth behind BDSM. Trying to answer questions like, do consensual sadists have the same personality traits as non-consensual sadists? Or do kinky people have the same quality of mental health as non-kinky people? And the results I find are often pretty interesting. Sadly, new quality research in this area is sparse, often due to stigma and lack of funding. I have talked to several academic researchers who are kinky themselves who have wanted to study BDSM as part of their career, only to be denied by their departments. When it gets studied, usually by someone outside of the community, their understanding of our culture and terminology is often woefully outdated. Up until very recently, most academics were still using terms like S&M and SM as catch-alls in their papers, rather than BDSM as one clear example of that. And we've been using BDSM in the community for over 10 years, maybe 20 at this point. That's how behind they are. Even in clinical sexology programs, according to what I've been told by some of you in my audience going through such training, references in textbooks to kink are either non-existent, inaccurate, or disparaging. The fact scientists themselves unquestioningly look at an interest in kink as a pathology is concerning, as such a framing would naturally influence not only the kind of research they do, but how they interpret their findings. How are we, as kinky people, supposed to understand ourselves better when the scientists looking at our behavior don't seem to understand us to begin with? Enter Dr. Justin Lehmiller, research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and former Harvard professor. His recent book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help Improve Your Sex Life, really surprised me. I've been wanting to read this book now for a couple of years, and I know his blog fairly well. And I wasn't quite sure how many new insights this book would have compared to that blog, and suffice to say, I'm really glad I read this book, because rather than continuing that trend of pathologizing kink, this book does the exact opposite, and it basically declares, hey, guess what? That thing you're into, the secret thing, probably totally normal. And I don't want to speculate about his private life, but his familiarity with modern kink terminology and community standards is refreshing, to say the very least. Though his work is supposed to be about general sexuality, there were several fascinating insights about people who have an interest in BDSM in this book. Some of his findings corroborate previous research in this area, and some of his conclusions challenge them. I'm hoping this might be a sign of a new leaf being turned over in academia where maybe, just maybe, kinky people might be understood on their own terms in research, rather than just being immediately declared abnormal from the outset. So, let's talk about the 5 new things I learned about kink from this book, what I agreed with, disagreed with, and what this might mean for future scientific inquiry on BDSM. So, the first thing I want to talk about is probably something you have heard me mention in passing in other videos, and this is the discovery of just how common kink fantasies are, because this whole book is all about looking at people's fantasy landscapes. From the way you hear kink critical types tell it, an interest in BDSM is a relatively uncommon thing, and it's indicative of extreme patriarchal brainwashing, yes, even if you are a lesbian who tops only other women. But in any case, Justin Lehmiller's survey, which looked at the fantasy lives of over 4,000 Americans, found the opposite. An interest in BDSM was one of the most popular fantasies. It was so popular that it ranked second overall behind only group sex. Only 4% of women and 7% of men had never fantasized about any kind of BDSM activity before. And over 25% of people said BDSM was their favorite fantasy subject. Why is it so popular though? There are a few theories out there. One is that BDSM is an umbrella term and can include anything from bondage to spanking to extreme sadomasochism. With such a wide net, there's just more opportunities that something will pique somebody's interest. This wide net also means capturing people with wandering minds is easier. People with adventurous imaginations may simply stumble onto kinky thoughts by accident one day and then repeatedly go back to them if they're enjoyable enough. This leads into and overlaps with another theory, which is the all-time classic of operant conditioning. If something is pleasurable, you're more likely to want to go back and do it over and over again, and it becomes reinforcing. More typical scientific theories include the idea that people enjoy BDSM as a form of escapism, using it as a way to get away from their life stresses or even their sexual anxiety. Dr. LeMiller posits that one reason why women might gravitate towards kink fantasies is because it allows them to escape from the cultural pressure they feel to not like sex at all or to not like sex too much, which is an idea that I think might have some merit. So, when you put all of these different theories together, it's not too surprising why a quarter or more of Americans might enjoy BDSM, at least as a fantasy. Though not precisely about BDSM, the second new thing I discovered from this book is exceptionally relevant for some of the recent conversations that we've been having on the channel. And that would be who has so-called forced sex fantasies and why people have them. I prefer to call this a ravishment fantasy, though Dr. LeMiller calls it forced sex in his book. The very idea that some women might like to be, let's say, taken is deeply offensive to some people. An entire cottage industry of self-styled radical feminists is sustained on debating whether or not it's okay for women to have fantasies like this and what it says about the kind of people who might want to facilitate recreating that fantasy in real life. And the framing of this issue is almost always that women are the ones who have fantasies about being taken, and that men fantasize about doing it to them. They fantasize about being the takers. But LeMiller's research showed that these fantasies are not so one-directional. While 2/3 of women had a forced sex fantasy, so did half of men. So yes, that means straight men also sometimes fantasize about being compelled into having sex as well. By women, presumably. While I doubt this piece of information by itself will do much to change the patriarchal conditioning makes women fantasize about their own being taken narrative, I hope it might be one more piece of evidence that could convince someone on the fence about it. Of course, a lot of the people that are saying they also have this fantasy in their men could just be gay, but it's enough men to where they can't all just be gay or bisexual. Later on in the book, Dr. LeMiller makes a related point about why some people who have been victims of sex crimes in the past may have BDSM or ravishment fantasies now. As he says, quote, "To be clear, this is not about people wanting to relive past abuse. Rather, it's far more plausible that this is a psychological coping mechanism through which some people may learn to temporarily alleviate anxiety stemming from prior victimization. Some victims may fantasize about sexual encounters that affirm and validate their self-worth. By contrast, however, other victims may try to buffer their feelings of self-worth by leaving their emotions at the door entirely and focusing only on the sex act itself in their fantasies." In other words, victims and survivors are not a monolith. Some will find healing in recreating their experiences in a safe container. Some will want to do the exact opposite, and some will have their desires change over time as they get more distance from the experience. And to be clear, not everyone who has a ravishment fantasy is someone who has experienced violence. Far from it. But for those who do have that particular overlap, we are doing them a disservice if we assume what they want or why they want it. In fact, I would even say that some sex-critical radfems are re-victimizing people by aggressively asserting that they absolutely should not have certain fantasies or should never ever do certain things in the bedroom or whatever. Like, dang, why are you trying so hard to make choices for them? What is that? But anyways, that's a conversation for another video. Let's move on to the third thing that I learned from this book, and this is a big one, and probably the most shocking for me out of anything I read in this entire book. And that is the revelation that women not only have fantasies about sadism in significant numbers, they actually fantasize about sadism more than men, at least when it comes to physical sadism. According to the research, approximately 35% of women sometimes or often fantasized about inflicting physical pain, and 60% had fantasized about it at all. 31% of men fantasized about inflicting physical pain sometimes or often, and about 56% had ever fantasized about it. Those numbers are pretty close ultimately, but way closer than you might expect going by the proportion of male to female toxic dominance in the scene and the number of women who participate in BDSM at any level who identify openly as being sadists. And as a woman who identifies as a sadist, but not as a top or a dominant myself, I have a few thoughts about what might be going on here. LeMiller notes that his study focused on more moderate forms of pain, like hot wax and spankings, and he wonders if the numbers might have been different had he focused more on intense forms of sadism. I'm not sure that would change much, though that might hint at why the numbers were higher for women than they may have been in previous studies. For example, many rough sex fantasies for women might include them scratching their partner's back or biting their partner from the sheer ecstasy of the experience, and they simply can't help themselves. In that case, the woman really isn't in control or even acting as a sadist as we would define it in the kink community, but they are still technically inflicting physical pain. It just means something different. It might be more about expressing a feeling of being out of control or being overcome with pleasure rather than getting off in the idea of their partner just suffering. I think getting to look at the qualitative content of women's pain-inflicting fantasies would be elucidating here. I think it's also possible that women feel safer inflicting pain on their partners than men do. And by that I mean women might feel more mentally comfortable physically hurting their imaginary lovers because there isn't a huge social stigma attached to it the way that there is for men. They don't get bombarded with messages that hitting a man is wrong or images of slovenly, beastly women punching their poor, fragile, innocent husbands from a young age. To put it simply, women are not told that they are monsters for having fantasies about physical pain the same way that men are. This stigma might lead men to underreport their sadistic fantasies, if anything, and in fact, this lack of messaging might also make it so women can enjoy the idea of hurting their lovers in a more casual way. It doesn't have to become part of their core identity because they don't have to overcome huge internal and external hurdles to accept that they might like inflicting pain sometimes. So they might not even recognize that they are being sadistic or that their desires are sadistic. Never mind the fact that sadism is a very heavily masculine-coded thing for other reasons, and that's likely also a factor here as well, because if you're not doing it in a masculine way, it might not read to you as being sadism because it's not like that, you know? Finally, there's also the simple fact that most heterosexual women are smaller and weaker than their partners, and they almost always are on average compared to their fantasy lovers. Because this sample is predominantly heterosexual women, it could also be that women feel more okay hurting their partners physically, knowing it is unlikely they could cause them any real lasting damage. It might therefore feel more often like play and not something dangerous. And on the flip side of that same coin, heterosexual men might feel less comfortable hurting their partners because, they don't know their own strength, and they would be too afraid if their fantasy ever became real that they might actually hurt someone they care about. LeMiller also suggests in his book that women, on average, have more sexual flexibility, that is, a willingness to deviate from what our society and culture has told us that we should want from sex. Essentially, it is our ability to enjoy different erotic concepts outside of the norm. So an interest in physical sadism might just be another outgrowth of that flexibility. What is interesting, and what is not mentioned directly in the book but is shown in the data behind the book, is that men are likewise slightly more likely to prefer psychological sadism. You would think, going by gender stereotypes, that, emotional, moody women might be more into psychological sadism, and big, strong, burly dudes, they're going to be more into physical sadism, but nope. About 28.5% of men had ever fantasized about causing psychological pain, compared to 24% of women. Again, these are pretty close numbers, all things considered, but it does show that there is a difference in the content between men and women's sadistic fantasies. And I would love to see maybe some more focused research on why this is. Maybe some qualitative fantasy analysis, a few samples to compare about how people write about these things. A girl could dream. One day, maybe. Maybe. Follow-up book, perhaps. But moving on, let's talk about the fourth thing I learned while reading Tell Me What You Want. Who exactly fantasizes about BDSM? Depending on where you look, you'll get opposite answers about the kinds of people who do BDSM and why. If you look at 50 Shades of Grey and other romance novels like it, dominants are eccentric, powerful men with troubled pasts who try to work out their mommy and or daddy issues in the bedroom. If you ask a pro-dom, they'd say powerful men are instead drawn to the other side of the slash. To escape from the pressures of the boardroom and constant decision-making, people with a lot of control in their day-to-day lives prefer to give it up and be submissive instead, at least for short periods. I've always thought this latter explanation felt a little off. After all, pro-doms aren't really seeing a representative sample of everyone who might want to be submissive, and they aren't going to attract wannabe dominants at all. It is expensive to hire a professional, and who has the time, money, and job security to be able to do that? Well, mostly people in the upper echelons of society, naturally. A professional might see the odd grocery store clerk or librarian now and again, but for the most part, the people who hire pro-doms are going to have a higher level of income on average, and they need the kind of discretion a professional can offer, rather than just, say, going to a public play party and trying to meet people that way. And according to Lemiller's research, it looks like my skepticism of this explanation was warranted. Quote, specifically, those who reported having more power tended to have more fantasies about dominance and sadism, whereas those with less power fantasized more about submission and masochism. Thus, although you may have previously heard that people with power use their fantasies to escape its burden, that doesn't seem to be the case. And this seems to ring true to my experience. This is more anecdotal evidence, but I know far more D-types in professional careers with advanced degrees than submissives. The D-types I have met, on average, also tend to make a lot more money, regardless of what field their career is in. Think doctors tend to be dominant, whereas nurses tend to be submissive. I'm not sure what this means, if anything, especially since in my experience, gender and age is also a confounding factor here. And I'm also looking at people who do BDSM rather than just having it as a fantasy. This is not to say that no one ever wants to take a break from calling all the shots at work all the time and relax by being submissive. I am very sure that is still the case for many people. It just also seems that many folks who like controlling and managing others in an everyday setting just happen to conduct themselves similarly in their private lives. They don't have a radical switch that happens. As usual, the answer is more complicated than just CEOs get tired too and they like someone else telling them what to do for once on Saturday nights. While escapism can be a factor in how one chooses to fantasize about BDSM or even do it in real life, it's not the only thing that influences the side of the slash one falls on, or why. And now we have my fifth and final finding, and it's a big one again. The mental health of people who have an interest in kink may not be as clear-cut as we previously thought. If you have seen my other videos debunking myths about kinky people, you've probably heard me push back on the idea that kinky people are all mentally ill, or that an interest in BDSM is caused by having a sick mind or something like that. People often cite a Dutch study to prove this isn't true, which was widely featured in publications like Psychology Today back when it came out in 2013. They found that, quote, BDSM practitioners were less neurotic, more extroverted, more open to new experiences, more conscientious, less rejection sensitive, had higher subjective well-being, yet were less agreeable, particularly among those who assumed the dominant, dom role. In fact, the only group that seemed to have worse mental health outcomes were submissive men, likely due to the social stigma they face and the struggles they often have when trying to find compatible partners. However, this study did have some limitations. namely that it was conducted in the Netherlands, a country famous for its inclusive and progressive sexual education. In fact, Dutch viewers make up a wildly disproportionate number of the viewers on my channel, something which I am not sure is only explained by how many Dutch people understand English. If the same study was conducted in just America or Canada, for example, countries with much worse sex ed and much more sexual shame, I doubt it would have had the same findings. Dr. LaMiller's survey of 4,000 Americans did show more complicated results, suggesting that people who had low self-esteem were more likely to fantasize about BDSM. But it's important to note that LaMiller's research looked at fantasy and not action. Most other studies on the mental health outcomes associated with BDSM were looking at BDSM practitioners and not fantasizers. It could be the case that people who have low self-esteem are less likely to try and make their fantasies into reality, or that the dissonance they feel between their fantasies and their actual lives contributes to their poor self-esteem. LaMiller theorized as much, stating that those who had been able to try their fantasies in real life had higher self-esteem, fewer feelings of guilt and shame, and better psychological adjustment than those who hadn't. Of course, we can't say which factor leads to what. Maybe people who have less shame feel more able to try out their desires in real life, but the preponderance of the data does seem to suggest that reducing dissonance and getting to act out our fantasies in a consensual manner makes our mental health better. And besides LaMiller's findings, there's actually a lot more new research on the health of BDSM practitioners, and I would love to dive into all that at some time. In the meantime, though, I'd love to know if we can sort out how to encourage people to try their fantasies in real life and possibly improve their well-being in doing so. But before we end the video today, there is one thing I want to note because it kind of took me by surprise. There is one part of this book I didn't love, and I just want to go over it. It's a small thing, but in the section where LaMiller discusses whether or not to act on your fantasies, he says, quote, "However, if an activity clearly and significantly elevates the risk of harm during sex, such as extreme BDSM acts that involve cutting or electric shocks, then it's not something I can recommend exploring in good conscience." And I understand his reluctance here as a mainstream educator and author, but there are lots of people like yours truly who do explore kinks like this, and they can be done in a safer, if not totally safe way. Are those the first kinks you should try out? Probably not, but that doesn't mean that they are bad or even suggest that you are a dangerous person for wanting to try them. Not to mention that something like an electric shock is totally vague. That's basically putting cattle prods, violet wands, and the e-stim devices that physical therapists use all in the same category, and the risks of those devices are not equivalent. But yeah, I just wanted to note that because it was one of the clearest things about BDSM in this book that just didn't quite sit right with me. But overall, I did really like this book. I would recommend it if you're like me and you're curious about scientific research on BDSM. You know, a 4,000 person survey is not maybe the best possible study ever, but this did have a lot of interesting data in it that I didn't even get into in this video right now, and I would check it out if you have enjoyed the other things that I've talked about from his research and other videos and from this video as well. It's a good read if you like to think about data and think about fantasies, or if you were trying to understand if your fantasies are normal and you're like, well, I don't know, Evie, I'm really into cross-dressing, or I'm really into this or that. Please read this book. I think if anything else, it's very validating for people who have a lot of stigma attached to their inner fantasy lives to read a book that over and over and over again says like, hey, guess what, buddy, you're normal. Like 80% of people have fantasized about that same thing before. So I really like it for that reason. Again, check it out if you want to. I'll have the title and everything down below so you can go and get it if you want to. And I would love to know you all think about this video in terms of the research findings. Do you have any other questions that you would want to follow up on? Did any of the results also take you by surprise, or were you just like, oh yeah, Evie, I totally expected all women to secretly be into sadism? Like, what do you mean you didn't pick up on that? Let me know what you think in a comment down below. And yeah, thank you all so much for watching. If you didn't already and you would like to, please do subscribe because I make videos twice a week about all different kink and BDSM related topics, including scientific research like in this video, as well as general education about BDSM and relationships. And finally, if you want to support what I do, the best way to do it is with Patreon. Link to that will be down below. If you do already support me there, thank you so much. It means the absolute world to me. And until I see you all next time, I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.